Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll look at the new seamline generation method that we introduced in MosaicPro for the ERDAS IMAGINE 2020 release. Seamline generation is one of the most important steps in the orthomosaicing workflow. When mosaicing images, adjacent ortho images may not line up geometrically in some places. There also may be places where there are radiometric differences between images. So having seamlines in the overlap region that hide many of these artifacts is necessary for creating a seamless mosaic. In ERDAS IMAGINE 2020, we have implemented a new seamline generation method, which we have called Optimal Seamline Generation. And as you can see, it's available as an additional seamline generation method to what we already have. How the method works is that it computes energy cost by considering color and gradient magnitude information and uses a graph cut energy minimization method to make the seamlines go through areas of high pixel similarity and avoiding areas where there are misalignments between the adjacent images. It does not take many parameters from the user. The only parameter that it changes is the relative weight of pixel similarity versus gradient. By default, both have equal weight and you get good results with that, but you can change it depending on the images you are working with. Let's see the new method in action. I have MosaicPro open with a few ortho images already loaded. The orthos for this demo are 15 cm JSD 4-band images captured from Leica CD camera around downtown Los Angeles area. Okay, let's bring the seamline generation dialog. We have now changed the optimal seamline to be the default generation method. I will not change any parameters. Let's simply start running it. The seamlines will be loaded automatically once the generation is completed. Okay, processing is completed and you can see the seamlines. It has avoided most of the buildings, mostly following roads and crossing through open fields. So the question that gets asked is, how does it compare with, for example, the weighted seamline generation method? Of course, this varies data by data, but generally you get significantly improved results with the new seamline generation method. Let me switch to my PowerPoint slide and I will show you a figure that compares the optimal seamline with the weighted seamline generation method. So for the same data we just ran now, I have the result from optimal seamline on the left and the weighted seamline on the right. While the weighted seamline method gives higher weight to finding seamlines around the nadir area, optimal seamline generation focuses more on avoiding feature-rich areas, which makes it generate much better result in urban areas. The next question is, how about performance? As you can see from the table, the optimal seamline generation method is slower. But generation of seamline is only part of the story. The seamlines have to be checked and edited in areas where they are not good. And this is where the optimal seamline generation method wins. You have significantly less editing with the seamlines generated by the optimal seamline generation method. So overall, the optimal seamline generation method generates quality seamlines, and since little time is spent editing it, you also get time savings. This completes the session. Thank you for listening.